We're moving on to the final presentation for the afternoon, and this addresses the topic WRC 23, the implementation of mid-band spectrum of 5G. To enlighten us on this topic, we have two presenters, and I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming the first. I invite Ms. Veena Rawat, GSMA, to share her perspective with us. Veena, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon and welcome. The screen is yours.
Okay, perfect. Can you hear me?
I'm hearing you loud and clear.
Okay, and what
There
would you like
go.
me?
We're seeing you and you're sharing the screen with us. Lovely.
Yeah, but I just want to make sure I have this in the screen mode so that you can see the whole thing.
Are you going to presentation mode?
Are you good now? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just cutting out all the noise here.
We need to get you to go to presentation mode.
Yeah, that's where I am going.
Yeah.
I don't see it here. Here, yeah, sorry. Get it. Perfect.
There you are.
Yep.
I must say it's a difference seeing you on screen as opposed to in person as we're used to. But we're happy to have you as well. So let me toss you. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. And let me start by saying many thanks to Teresa Watkins and CANTO for inviting me to speak on this very important subject of the WRC 23, and specifically what are the implications of the mid-band spectrum on 5G. Moving on then, my first slide. Before I start with my presentation, let me make some comments. You know, one of the reasons I really participate in all the CTU meetings and CANTO meetings, and I'm very much interested, is that the Caribbean countries matter a lot for the preparations for these ITU meetings, in particular for the WRC. The Caribbean countries come together. As you know, that we prepare for the ITU meetings, for the WRCs, in our region in the Americas at CETA, and the Caribbean countries come together. And they can make or break some of the common proposals which we submit from CETA to the ITU. The WRCs these days work on, well, they work on regional proposals. The regional proposals have a lot more weight than individual country proposals. As you can recognize, regional proposals, you know, if we get from CETA, there are 34 countries involved, or from Africa, 54 countries are involved. So that's the voice of that many countries. So there is a lot more weight. And CETA has its own procedure for approving the proposals. And I can tell you, at least for the last two conferences, 2015 and 2019, that on important issues, so at least to me, the mobile broadband issues, the Caribbean countries as a group have made a big difference in actually getting the support for these very important proposals. Last time for the millimeter wave bands, and now this time the focus of the WRC 23 is, well, it's in all low band, mid band, and high capacity bands, the millimeter wave bands. But as I said, I will focus on mid band. So I really wanted to highlight that the preparations are heating up now, are increasing now for WRC 23. We have starting, you know, the year 21 now, and I would hope that the countries will continue to participate, you know, as they have done in the past. So looking at this screen, the WRC 23, as I said, it's really providing on the agenda. We have the agenda items dealing with low band, which is the agenda item 1.5, which I'm not going to focus on today, and that's particularly for region 1, which is the Africa, Europe, and Middle East and the Russian bloc. So I'm not going to focus on low band today, but I can. It's an important agenda item from our perspective also, and time permitting, I might make a comment later at the end. My focus will be mid-band, and the mid-band, the three frequency ranges being considered are the 3300 to 3800, 4800 to 4990 megahertz, and the mid-band, the 6 gigahertz band we refer to as the 6425 to 7125 megahertz. And then there is a touch of the millimeter wave band, and that's just for the Americas, 10 to 10.5 gigahertz. So my focus will be in the middle for the mid-band. You will see on the next chart that the agenda is a little strange this time in the sense that these low band, mid band, and the millimeter wave band, the high capacity band, 10 gigahertz, they're kind of spread, they are distributed regionally. Here is my chart. They are distributed kind of, region-wise, and as well as including the frequency range-wise. And what I mean by that, if you look at this chart and look at the map, the agenda, and my focus, by the way, will be on agenda item 1.2, because that covers the mid bands. And these mid bands, if you look at the green portion, the 3300 to 3400 megahertz is part of agenda item 1.2. 3600 to 3800 megahertz is also part of agenda item 1.2, but it's only for the Americas, and hence I jump here on the blue portion, region 2. And then we have 4800 to 4990 megahertz, and then 6 gigahertz band, which is the 700 megahertz range. So the bandwidth is very large, 700 megahertz. And it is covered by 5 agenda items, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and I guess 4 agenda items, 1.5 here. 1.4 is also deals with the IMT, but it deals with IMT on high altitude base stations, and hence I have not really included it here. So as I said, I'll focus on 1.2 agenda item. And why am I focusing on it? You will say 1.1 is also mid-band. This 4800 to 4990 megahertz, yes, it is mid-band, and it will be considered at the WRC, but it has certain restrictions because of its use by aeronautical and maritime radars in international waters, etc. So because of that, my focus is, it's a very good band, 190 megahertz bandwidth, but I'm not going to be talking about much details there. So look at the band 3300 to 3800 megahertz range. I go to the next slide to show you what exactly that range means. And I'm really pleased this morning, you had a wonderful presentation from Jose Ayala from representing GSA, Jose being from Ericsson. And he covered and he showed you this whole 500 megahertz range from 3300 to 3800 megahertz. That's what is going to be covered at the WRC. While this blue portion, the 3400 to 3600, is harmonized globally now. So we have only 200 megahertz right now globally harmonized. Although, as Jose mentioned, and he gave you a statistics on a large number of networks which are already being deployed or authorized or planned to be authorized in the entire range, 3.3 to 4.2 gigahertz, or 3.3 to 4.0 gigahertz, I should say. And it really depends. So what I'm showing you on this chart is that this upper 200 megahertz, 3.8 to 4, it is, I don't know if you followed the US auctions. It started in last December, finished in January. It was probably one of the biggest, what should I say, the revenue or the money generated by this auction, close to $70 billion. The band was from 3.7 to 4.0 gigahertz, so it was 300 megahertz. So what's WRC going to consider? It's going to consider this 100 megahertz, 3.3 to 3.4, and it's going to consider 3.6 to 3.8 because this middle portion is already globally harmonized. Now, why are we interested in a much broader range for this mid-band, very important part of the mid-band spectrum here? What is needed is broad, larger bandwidth channels. If you have 100 megahertz channels for each operator, it is going to improve the performance significantly. You obviously, larger the bandwidth, larger the spectrum, the larger the data rates you could do. It will improve the performance, but also very importantly, it will reduce the cost of the connectivity. And let me show you the next slide, how we can reduce the cost of the connectivity here. GSMA has done studies, and we have shown through these studies that if you have 100 meg channels, you have the number of cell sites are X number, say X. However, if you reduce that bandwidth from 100 meg to 100 meg to 60 megahertz, the number of cell sites, the number of base stations you have going to be putting increases by 64%. And that's where the cost comes. And the numbers here at the bottom are, we have the baseline 200 megahertz globally harmonized, as I mentioned a couple of times now, 3.4 to 3.6, which we did in WRC 15. But now this WRC is going to consider another 300 megahertz of the bandwidth, the 3.3 to 3.4 and 3.6 to 3.8, the lower and the upper edge around it. If you add that 300 megahertz, which many countries are already doing, then you would have huge benefits and the savings in rolling out globally. And look at the numbers are very large, of 50 billion. If you also get 700 megahertz bandwidth in the 6 gigahertz, which I showed you a minute ago here, in the 6 gigahertz bandwidth, the 6425 to 7125 megahertz spectrum, if you add that additional 700 megahertz, the additional savings total in terms of the infrastructure globally is close to 80 billion. In this study, GSMA has looked at it, what the savings are on individual regions, if you add additional 300 meg in the 3.5 gig range or 700 meg. But here I'm just giving you, in the interest of time, the numbers on a global basis. So moving in then, that's the 3.5 gigahertz range, and you can understand the importance of that additional 300 megahertz we should focus on for the WRC 23. And as Jose mentioned, the studies will happen. They are starting to happen in the ITU because no spectrum is vacant. There are incumbents. We need to study sharing and compatibility. And obviously, your participation is very much welcome in those studies because those studies are very, very important for the WRC's decisions. So coming now to the 6 gigahertz range. The whole 6 gigahertz range, when you talk about it, is really 5925 to 7125. Okay, there's 1200 megahertz of spectrum in that range. That spectrum is currently used by the operators for backhaul, by the MNOs, but for backhaul. There are also other fixed system users. Backhaul is fixed, right? To carry your traffic from the base station sites. There are satellite applications, satellite use also in the spectrum. And I refer to this part of the spectrum, 5925 to 6425 as lower 6 gigahertz. And what is under the WRC consideration from here to here is 6425 to 7125. Sorry, I'm just rattling these numbers. I mean, they are in my head. I think and dream about them. That 700 megahertz bandwidth is the part of the WRC 23 discussion. What is happening is because there is global mobile allocation now, globally, the band is allocated to mobile on a primary basis. Many countries, or some countries, are looking at this 6 gigahertz band and looking at its potential use for licensed, which is the mobile broadband IMT, as well as for some unlicensed use such as Wi-Fi or the 3GPP standard 5G NRU. Some countries have made the decisions. As I start from the bottom, the USA has looked at, has decided to just go for the unlicensed for the entire band. Europe has only gone for the unlicensed in the lower 6 gigahertz. They are going to really wait and see what happens at the WRC 23 for the upper part of the 6 gigahertz, because it is an extremely important part for the mid-band spectrum, for the expansion of the mid-band spectrum for licensed mobile broadband. So the decision is going to, their thinking is that we should really see how things happen at the WRC 23 and then go later on for that. China is interested, and I'm talking about these large markets here, that they want the whole band to be for licensed. Again, I repeat, the WRC 23 discussions will be in the upper part where the 700 megahertz bandwidth is at stake. So, where do we go for the considerations? In terms of my summary, for the 3.5 gig, I'll come back to the 6 gig in a minute. We only have 200 meg globally harmonized. We need, if we are going to have a 3.5 gig authorized to the operators, and if we have 3 to 5 operators, we are looking for more than 200 megahertz, and hence we are looking for the harmonization of additional spectrum and that additional 300 megahertz. Access to that spectrum is crucial because the networks are now operating, the devices are available, and hence it is the mid-band which is developing extremely fast. And why do we need the mid-band? We need the mid-band to not only really deal with the urban capacity, meet the urban capacity needs, but it's extremely also very, very important for fixed wireless access. And during the current pandemic, I think we have learned a lot that how important that high-speed broadband through fixed wireless access in the rural areas is. And 3.5 gig is crucial for those applications also. The cost efficiency I mentioned, that if we will have 100 megahertz channels, then the lower network density will reduce the cost significantly. And then this band is why mid-band provides, it's a good band for capacity as well as for coverage. Okay, my last slide then is, let me say, the 6 gigahertz. As I said, once you have done the 3.5 gigahertz, there is no other mid-band spectrum. I showed in the beginning there was 10 to 10.5 gigahertz. That is really, it's a good capacity band. It's considered for Americas, but it is going outside the mid-band, more or less mid-band range. It's providing millimeter wave capacity. So now, looking at this, as I mentioned, that a lot is happening in the 6 gigahertz, both in the lower 6 gigahertz and in the upper 6 gigahertz. In the lower 6 gigahertz, as I mentioned, some countries have gone for unlicensed use, and the regulators can consider if they think the Wi-Fi spectrum in 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz is not enough, they can consider. But you have to make sure that if you're going to go for unlicensed spectrum, that there is sufficient network available for the backhaul use, whether it is through the microwave backhaul or whether it is fiber development. Because you can add a lot of capacity to the unlicensed, but if you do not have the back end of it to carry the traffic through, then that spectrum is not very good for the Wi-Fi use. So you can consider for unlicensed use if needed in your country. The next spectrum is the 6425 to 7125 megahertz, which I said is on the WRC 23 agenda. It only provides the opportunity or for the expansion of the midband. There is no other option for midband spectrum. So it is very important to watch what is happening. Yes, some countries such as United States has gone for unlicensed spectrum here. But one needs to watch is how the market develops for that unlicensed spectrum. And not only that, the very important aspect of this is in both the lower 6 and the upper 6 is to make sure that the backhaul, which is being used by the operators, is not impacted. If the operators use this 6 gigahertz band, the upper 6 gigahertz band, for example, if they use it for the mobile component, for the IMT component, they can manage it they can decide on their own whether it is backhaul, whether it is mobile broadband, or whether it is integrated backhaul. That becomes an internal decision for their infrastructure use. So it's an extremely important band, and as I said, would be discussed at the WRC, the 700 megahertz bandwidth. So what can regulators do for the 6 gigahertz? Make sure the backhaul is protected, because that's really robbing the Peter to pay Paul otherwise. Avoid decisions that cannot be reverted. If you go for this unlicensed spectrum, as the name suggests, you do not know where it is used. You do not know the locations of the stations where it is used. You cannot coordinate. So the regulators, and I as a former regulator can tell you that very 100%. Regulators, when they go for unlicensed spectrum, they want to be absolutely sure that this will not require a reversing of the decision, that no, at some point we would want it to be used for licensed, because it is very, very difficult to turn off that. You have to look at the core network availability, and in that core network, consider the cost efficiency of adding the additional 700 megahertz, and hence consider the decisions for your own sub-regional approach or country by country, state by state, for the upper 6 gigahertz, which is the 700 megahertz, for, follow the market and see what you want to do, and wait for the WRC 23 and see what the decisions come out for the upper 6 gigahertz. And in the meantime, there would be, discussion about this band, 6425 to 7125 megahertz. Although I should mention that for our region, it's a top 100 megahertz. But as I also mentioned before, that the mobile allocation is in the entire range. And what that means is that, you can use the band for any application of the mobile service, that we consider that, that 700 megahertz as an expansion band for 5G. There would be no other option to 3.5 gigahertz as the networks grow and you need high capacity. That is my last slide. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to address any questions now if the organizers allow that, or I haven't followed the chat session here, so please let me know. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Veena, for that very informative presentation. We will get back to you shortly, so I'm holding you in standby position. If time permits, then we would facilitate. And again, I have to emphasize, if time permits. So let me not utilize too much of that time. Let's move on to our very next contributor in this segment, CANTO's very own Melesia Sutherland. Director Sutherland, are you with us? I think we need you to unmute your microphone, Melesia.
You know, the microphone continues to be elusive despite a lot of attempts in 2020. So ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thanks for staying with us. Veena, always such a pleasure to see you. So hopefully I'll get some more of your knowledge a little later as folks ask questions. I am going to load my presentation just now. So let me share screen. Just give me a few seconds, please. And let me go into present slideshow mode.
There we go.
Slideshow from the beginning. Are you guys seeing my screen? Just let me know, please.
Yes, we are seeing your screen. We are. Excellent.
Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon I want to talk to you about the World Radio Conference agenda and the agenda items that are of particular interest to the Caribbean. You would have heard a lot of talk about 5G from Tim Burke, from Jose Ayala, and also from Veena this afternoon, as well as from Mike and Giovanni. So every 4 years, we have what is called a World Radio Conference. And what that conference does is to determine the spectrum that can be harmonized globally for spectrum use, including for mobile, satellites, aviation, weather systems, all kinds of services that use mobile. Typically, this agenda can be pretty wide, extensive, and it is intensive in terms of the work that needs to be done for each cycle. I will just go into why we're interested in the spectrum. Some of the information I will skim over because we have looked at it earlier in several presentations. As Tim had mentioned, we do need all kinds of spectrum for 5G to work, both low, mid, and high band spectrum. For WRC 19, that was concluded in 2019, we had identified globally spectrum from 24.25 gigahertz up to 71 gigahertz for high band spectrum, which is typically called millimeter wave spectrum. Low band spectrum tends to be pretty scarce, so operators tend to reform over time to get low band spectrum. In the Caribbean, we don't have the spectrum crunch that larger countries have. But what we do need is an ecosystem to make services like 5G work. Tim Burke would have spoken extensively about just the cost of rolling out 5G. In the US, where some companies are using millimeter wave spectrum, you find that there's a densification because the antennas are smaller, more building permits are needed, and they have to be very close. So there's a great deal of proliferation of equipment, and it's very expensive. So the Caribbean needs an ecosystem that will work. And because of this, mid-band spectrum is very important to us because we are a region that is mostly mobile connected. I want us to look at agenda item 1.2 and exactly what it says. It says basically, and this agenda item would have been determined from the previous World Radio Conference in 2019. So agenda item 1.2 says to consider the identification of frequency bands 3.3 to 3.4, 3.6 to 3.8, 6.425 to 7.025 megahertz, 7.025 to 7.125 megahertz, and 10 to 10.5 gigahertz for international mobile telecommunications, including possible additional allocation to the mobile services on a primary basis. You will see that I have some asterisks on the slide, and basically I have just put that beside the spectrum that applies to our region. We are in region 2, the Americas. So I am just pointing out for us those frequencies that are specific to our region for IMT identification. And IMT identification is basically broadband. It's about identifying the spectrum for the delivery of broadband service. So in that case, we have for identification for the use of broadband in our region, we have 3.3 to 3.4 gigahertz, as well as 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz. And for global identification, meaning that globally, this is the range that we're seeking to harmonize for global IMT. We're talking about in the 7 gigahertz range. And then we also have 10 to 10.5 gigahertz. And Veena had mentioned that in her presentation. IMT, as I mentioned, is just a generic term for broadband mobile systems. Sometimes we see these terms and we wonder what they are about. And the WRC has a host of terms. So it's just about a broadband service. Why mid-band spectrum? We've had a lot of discussion on mid-band spectrum this morning because that is what is on the agenda. For 5G, just to remind us, in WRC 2019, we would have identified worldwide the frequencies for high-band spectrum because we do need very large chunks of spectrum, typically over 100 megahertz. We would have done that for 2019, so tick for the world. Now we're going into the mid-band spectrum for WRC 23. And really, it is in the middle. It's between the low band and the high band. So it actually provides higher capacity than the low bands and greater coverage, including for indoors, than the high bands, the millimeter waves spectrum that was determined in 2019. So it really is what we would call a sweet spot. This kind of spectrum will also address congestion in urban areas, give you wide coverage, still give you capacity. It's also important in countries where millimeter wave is not really an option. For the Caribbean, millimeter wave would be very difficult simply because of the investment in the infrastructure that is required. You'd have heard earlier on about just the cost of rolling out the spectrum, the infrastructure. So where you have to have a lot of equipment that raises the cost of the service, it becomes very difficult to use very high band spectrum, as had been mentioned earlier. And then there are countries who struggle to reform sufficient wideband spectrum. So this will be new spectrum for them. Again, the Caribbean really doesn't have that great spectrum crunch, but we need a cost-effective ecosystem to deliver the service to our customers. So what are the challenges to the mobile industry actually acquiring mid-band spectrum? As Veena had mentioned, there is no spectrum that is vacant. All the spectrum actually have occupants already. So it's really going to those occupants to say, hey, we do have these new services and technology has allowed us to offer these new services. And we are already in the range with you, but there's some additional stuff that we want to do. So we're going to work with you to make sure that you are protected. You can still continue to offer your services, but with the additional service that we want to offer because of the new technology, we're going to have to work out how we can do that. So we talk about doing the studies that had been mentioned earlier. These are technical studies where groups of folks actually go together, look at the technical parameters to decide whether or not various services can coexist. Now, in terms of the C-band, that mid-band 3 gigahertz to 8 gigahertz, a pretty wide range. As Veena had mentioned, there are folks in there. The satellite operators, fixed satellite services tend to operate in that band, and while they're decreasing, C-band is still extensively used in some countries because of its favorable coverage and propagation. I believe some studies were done for WRC 15, and at the time it was shown that compatibility could not have been achieved in the spectrum for C-band, but now we are at a different place with 5G, and it's believed that compatibility is more likely, but the studies will determine that. So this is actually based on technical studies. I know that for WRC 19, there were challenges, well, maybe I shouldn't say challenges, but the parameters of some of the technical studies were challenged. Some said that the parameters were too narrow, they were too restrictive, They could work if they were just tweet tell it here, tweet tell it there. That's all a part of the negotiations. Again, as Veena had mentioned, discussion of 6 gigahertz, should it be license exempt or not? And noting that license exempt spectrum cannot meet the need for large scale network deployments. Spectrum is in the hands of government. Spectrum is assigned by spectrum management agencies, by government ministries, by regulators. So at the end of the day, how spectrum is used in a country is determined by government policy and direction. So those are the challenges for mid-band spectrum. For us in the Caribbean region, many of the agenda items on the WRC agendas every 4 years tend to be a little exotic, because we don't have a lot of satellites in the region, in that we don't manage satellites, we don't own satellites, we don't do a lot of stuff with the aviation. I mean, we are impacted like the rest of the world, but we don't have those industries in our country. So it can be a little exotic. And we're very focused on mobile, because most of our people are connected by mobile, and we understand mobile, we understand base stations, and we understand the delivery of service using that mode. Now, here for us, WRC 23, and perhaps if we have the time, Veena can speak to this some more. We're talking about high altitude IMT base stations. We're talking about a cell site, a base station up in the sky. Now, this started out as HAPS, and the high altitude platform was previously assigned fixed spectrum, and now HAPS is moving on to mobile spectrum. The intent, and hopefully you can see my screen, because it's a little small now. The intent is that these base stations in the sky would be used as a part of our terrestrial IMT network. So in the same way that I'm connected to a cell tower when I make a call, I'm watching a video clip or something like that, or doing some kind of media download, in the same way it is intended that the base stations in the sky will do a very similar thing. This agenda item, which is agenda item 1.4, it invites the ITU to conduct sharing and compatibility studies for certain frequency bands below 2.7 gigahertz. In 694 megahertz and 960 megahertz, 1.710 megahertz, 1.885 megahertz, 2500 megahertz, and 2690 megahertz. Now, for those of us, again, we are very familiar with mobile technology in this region, with cell site operations, and so we already know that some of our mobile services are already on some of these frequencies. We have definitely mobile in 800, 850 megahertz. We also have in some in 1800 megahertz as well. So we have an active interest in this agenda item, and the sharing studies to be done will determine whether or not HIBs can actually coexist with the base stations that are actually on the ground. In addition to what I just stated, the whole definition of HIBs is also up for discussion. So what are the challenges that HAPS will face, just as how mid-band spectrum has challenges? So already mentioned, we have mobile frequencies in below 27 megahertz. The issue of interference from HIBs that are operating in neighboring countries. What will the regulatory framework look like? Will it look like will it be a similar framework as exists for current operators on the ground? Will there be licensing? Will there be a level playing field? Will things look very different? Huge question for us in the region who are operators, and as you all know, CANTO represents operators and vendors, and the operators are the members. So huge question for the operators that what will this business model for terrestrial mobile operators look like? As it is, we all know that we're struggling with the providers who use our infrastructure, and we don't have that revenue to replenish infrastructure, which is part of what leads to the low ARPU that Tim has spoken about. We also know that there are LEO satellites that are, thousands of satellites are planned to be churned out, and many hundreds are already out up in the sky. And those are intended to deliver a service. Typically, the new services do say to underserved and rural areas, but those, the equipment can offer service to anybody. So another issue to consider, very direct for us, is what will that business model look like? Our key messages. Definitely, there's an opportunity offered by HIBS, that is a high altitude platforms for IMT base station. So basically a base station in the sky. There's an opportunity to look at such technologies bridging the digital divide. At the same time, the regulatory framework is key for protecting competition. With HIBS, governments must represent what local industry needs to flourish, facilitate connectivity, and keep people in the region employed. As said before, CANTO members operate in the Caribbean region, where most of the population is connected to mobile networks. Because of this, we support all proposals at WRC 23 that will provide more spectrum for CANTO members to expand the range, quality, affordability, sophistication, and flexibility of services offered while driving development in the region. We encourage our governments to support IMT identification for the ranges 3.3 gigahertz to 3.4 gigahertz, 3.6 gigahertz to 3.8 gigahertz, 7.025 gigahertz to 7.125 gigahertz, 10 gigahertz to 10.5 gigahertz. We have worked with the Caribbean Telecommunications Union in the last two WRCs in 2015 and 2019, and every cycle we work better and better, and every cycle the region makes better and better progress in terms of that collaboration. We're looking forward to that collaboration for this WRC period, and we're expecting to get even better and better. This item though on HIBS is very, very direct to the mobile operators in the region. Collaboration is key. We heard about it this morning. We heard from Jose this morning. We also heard from Prime Minister for Guyana, and we also heard throughout the presentations about the need for collaboration, and it's absolutely crucial for these global events. Now, if you are interested in working with CANTO in putting forward the WRC 23 position should be for the region, we welcome your involvement in this matter. Just contact the Secretariat and we will add you to the group that will be working on these matters. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much. Let me end with the key messages again. Collaboration, remembering that we have to, you know, in everything, look at how we're going to develop the region, develop our industries, keep our people employed, and get everybody connected. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for your time. Questions are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melesia. Thank you, Veena. Thank you, Melesia. Melesia, you have done such a fantastic job in wrapping up the official proceedings. However, those of us with questions or concerns or contribution, we have opportunities, not just today, but tomorrow as well, where we can engage each other on the platform. So again, I say thank you so much. Thanks again, Veena. Thank you so much, Melesia, Director CANTO. Well, my friends, we are perilously close to wrapping up for today, but in true CANTO style, we can't wrap up without an opportunity to shake a leg. If we had the person-to-person experience, you know we'd be heading to a lounge or somewhere where we can all enjoy each other's company in a social setting. Well, at this virtual event, we are going to do just that. You have the setting, we have the entertainment. So don't forget, tomorrow we begin at 9 a.m. promptly, and the highlight of tomorrow's agenda, it's the AGM. So as we wrap up day one of CANTO Connect 2, AGM and a mini expo, this is where I ask you to take your leave from this room and rejoin us for some fantastic entertainment by one of the finest DJs in the business, alongside her partner. I'm talking about DJ Charlotte and Aaron Fingal. So we get set for them. Nice. Yes, so we get set for them. So as I said, feel free to take your leave and join us at the next session. That's it for day one. See you tomorrow, please God, at 9 a.m. sharp. Yep.